Hi there, my name is Ayelet Connell and I'm a gluten-free and paleo chef, and this is an episode of Simply Paleo with me. Today we're going to be making something that's very dear to my heart and part of my Jewish heritage. It's called the Babka, and Babka is loosely translated into a Jewish raisin bread. It can have chocolate in it, it can have cinnamon, frequently has raisins, but it's sort of a sweet bread that looks like a challah or a sandwich bread, but then has this sort of swirled stuff throughout it. And there's zillions of versions depending on who your Jewish grandmother or great-grandmother was and the recipe that was passed down. But of course, me living on a paleo lifestyle, it was definitely an exploration and mission of mine to figure out how to make a delicious paleo version of a babka. So that's what we're going to do. I actually took my paleo sandwich bread recipe and I modified it to add in these swirly ingredients. And it's so delicious and yummy and super healthy and high protein because there's a ton of eggs in it. So let's get started. So what we're going to do first, we're going to talk about the ingredients. So in this bowl, what I have is a bunch of different alternative flours that make it more of a paleo version of a bread. So we've got 1 1/4 cups of cassava flour. And cassava flour is a grain-free flour that's from the cassava root or the yucca root. And in addition to that, we have 1/2 cup of arrowroot, which is also from a root. And then we have 1/4 cup of ground flax, and I have golden ground flax seeds in here. And then in addition to that, I've added 1 teaspoon of baking powder, and I like to use a corn-free version of baking powder to make it more paleo and less inflammatory. And then also 1 teaspoon of fine sea salt. And then I've mixed it in here just so I have sort of my dry part of the batter. And now I'm just going to set it aside. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 6 eggs and I'm going to whisk them until they froth. They're not going to whip like a meringue because we're not using just the egg whites. We're going to actually be using the whole eggs, which is more of a complete protein and makes this bread so nutritious. And we're going to put in 6 eggs. So we've got here our eggs, and let's get cracking. And so we're just going to put them right in here. And what I love about this bread is, A, how fun it looks. The marbling, it's so beautiful to look at. And I'm not a huge fan of raisins. They're really one of those foods that just texturally are really off-putting to me. Of course, lots of people love raisins, and they're, a fun snack to have. But for whatever reason, when they're in a bread, I love them. I don't know what that's about. It's very bizarre. We all have sort of our food idiosyncrasies and eccentricities, and that's one of mine. And so this bread is sort of my one homage to a raisin-friendly dish for me. And what's nice is when they bake, when the bread bakes, the raisins just get nice and plump and juicy and silky in texture, and it's such a fun little change in the density of the bread, which is so lovely. Okay, so we've got our 6 eggs in here. We're going to set aside our shells to discard. And what I'm going to do is use a KitchenAid to get these nice and frothy nice and quickly, but you don't have to do that. You can just use a whisk. Just really take the time to get it to have bubbles, sort of a layer of bubbles on top. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's get this up here. We're going to just put this on medium. It won't take very long. I'm going to get it nice and frothy. And this is what makes it so nutritious. You definitely want to use eggs that are natural eggs, so the chickens don't have any antibiotics or growth hormones. You can use organic eggs. And off we go. And they're close. And we're looking for bubbles. I'm looking for a layer of froth. Because what we're trying to do is aerate them a little bit. Oh, we're getting bubbles. All right, fabulous. And so the idea is to get a froth on top with bubbles to try to aerate it, which helps with the bread. So what we're going to do is we're going to carefully remove the eggs into this large bowl. Maintain some of the frothiness. All right. Okay. Set that aside. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add in a few liquid ingredients. And we're not going to mix. We really want the ingredients to not converge and interact yet. We're just going to add them in, and then we're going to add in the flour, and the baking powder is going to react with the apple cider vinegar, and we're going to have a chemical reaction that'll make this fabulous bread. So here we go. We've got a half a cup of warm water. Yeah. And then we want to put in a half a cup of olive oil. And again, we're not doing any mixing, we're just adding. So we're pouring this in, and I realize I forgot one thing, which is the honey. So I'll grab that momentarily from the kitchen. That'll be your blooper for the morning, or whenever you're watching this. All right, so we'll add in our half cup of olive oil, extra virgin. Okay, and then we're going to do a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar. And you want to do a raw, unfiltered apple cider vinegar because it's got just such healthy added benefits to it. Apple cider vinegar is one of those foods that's so good for you in lots of ways. It helps to alkalinize the gut to try to help create more acid-base balance in your digestive tract, so it can help a lot with things like reflux and just heartburn and those sorts of issues. Okay. So here's your blooper. I'm running to the cabinet to get the honey, and you can hear me because I'm still talking with you. But the honey is a nice little touch. We're not going to add a lot of honey. We're going to put in about 1.5 tablespoons just to give it a little bit of a sweetness. So here we've got our spoon, and we're going to add in about 1.5 tablespoons of honey. Okay. And then we're going to scrape it off so it's all in here. And that also helps to cover up some of that apple cider vinegar flavor. All right, and then what we're going to do without doing any mixing at all is we're going to take our flour that's already been mixed so that everything is combined, and we're going to just add it in. And then what we're going to do, rather than just traditionally mixing it, we're going to fold. We're going to fold the batter together. We're going to fold the liquid and the dry until there's no clumps. Now, you might see a little bit of grainy texture because of the ground flax, but there shouldn't be, pea or larger sized bits. And if there are, try to break them apart gently with a spatula. Because then they're probably just bits of flour. Of course, flour is a funny term because these are grain-free alternative flours, but they still do the job. And alone, even without putting the honey in, that's the standard paleo sandwich bread recipe of mine. But by putting in a little bit of honey, and then I'm going to show you how to make this into a babka, it makes it a bit of a different thing. But if you do, omit the honey and just leave the batter as is, and then you can put in even things like chopped rosemary, chopped olives. You can really get into creating any sort of flavor profile that you're looking for. You could make, a sun-dried tomato olive loaf, where you took sun-dried tomatoes and olives and pimentos that were, pitted, and just chopped them up nice and fine, or left them as clumps. And they're essentially your raisins, they're just sprinkling through it. And then you're going to find that it's going to give it such a wonderful flavor of a bread. So we're getting here close. We've gotten through most of the lumps. And it's just this silky batter texture. It's very wet. So I'm not looking for anything that's too thick. This is going to be a wet batter because of all the eggs. But in the end, it's going to create a beautiful bread that has a bread texture. When you eat paleo, so often for breads, it's made out of almonds and coconuts, which are very nutritious foods, but sometimes we can have too much of one thing, and then it creates more of an allergenic response. So I find that, mixing it up a little bit is a good idea, and for people that are sensitive to nuts, this is a fantastic option. This isn't an autoimmune paleo bread because of the high quantity of eggs, but it's a good option for people that are looking to just have a healthier diet, but still have bread, which is one of those categories that we all yearn for. Okay, So we've got our bread. Now, what we're going to do, a couple of things. We're going to set this aside, our batter, and then we're going to make a syrup. So I've got in here a heaping tablespoon of raw cacao powder. You can substitute that with an unsweetened cocoa powder. The difference between cocoa and cacao, if you think about the cocoa beans, when they're initially processed into powder, they're actually fermented and then they're ground up into a cacao powder. But when the beans, after they're fermented, are roasted and then ground into a powder, that's actually a cocoa powder. Both have a lot of nutrients to them, a lot of minerals and all kinds of wonderful benefits. But when it's cacao, you have that added fermentation that's just lovely and so good for the body. So we've got a heaping tablespoon of raw cacao powder in here, and we also have a teaspoon of cinnamon, which you can leave out if you don't love cinnamon, but this gives it a nice sort of fragrance and flavor. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put in, say, 2 tablespoons of maple syrup. Whoops. All right. And then we're going to whisk it. And initially it'll look like, I didn't put enough in because it's still dry. But you just keep whisking, and that couple tablespoons of maple syrup will be enough. Just keep going, making a bit of a mess here with my cocoa powder going everywhere, but that's okay. It'll take about a minute of whisking, and then you're going to see, ooh, that does look like a chocolate syrup. And you can see now it's getting nice and chocolatey. You can also add a little bit of vanilla to this, but I typically don't, although certainly if that's a flavor profile you like, you could do that instead of the cinnamon, but it doesn't matter so much. And we've got our lovely chocolate syrupy texture here that we're going to be folding into the bread. I'll show you that. We're going to do that once it's already in the bread tin. So you've got that. You can see it's a nice, beautifully rich chocolate syrup that you can totally lick the bowl after you get all the ingredients out. We're going to set this aside for the moment, and we're going to get our batter bowl back. Now, sometimes what I do is I put this in the refrigerator to cool a little bit. That always seems to help things, but it's not essential. We've got about 1/2 cup of raisins, just organic raisins. So we're going to take the raisins and put them in. You can leave these out if you prefer not, but it's a fun texture. And we're just going to fold in the raisins. All right. And then what we're going to do is take our bread tin. Now, when you're making a bread and you've got your bread pan, it's helpful to take parchment paper and line it, because without the parchment paper, the bread can have kind of a cakey outer layering because of when you take it off of the actual container. But if you put the parchment paper in, it gives it sort of that dried bread look on the outside. So it's a good idea. Now, I have 2 sheets of parchment paper. I have one that's sort of vertical and one that's horizontal. And then I've got my little clippies here because sometimes the paper just sort of falls in and then you make this big, enormous mess. But we have them nice and long in the beginning, and then afterwards I'm going to trim it before it goes into the oven. And I did preheat the oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit before we started. So we've got our bread here, or our batter, our bread batter. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the bread batter and we're going to pour it into the bread tin. You don't want to go all the way to the top. You can go pretty close. It is going to rise a little bit. And the baking powder and just the eggs in general are going to make it rise a bit. So we're going to get all of that good stuff in there. And then we're going to set that aside. And so now what we're going to do, we've got the raisins in here, but now we still have to do something with this delicious syrup. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the syrup and I'm going to drizzle it. And just kind of, it doesn't matter the pattern, but sort of around. Nice and yummy. And then what I'm going to do is just take my knife and I'm going to create kind of a marbleized pattern up and down. Rather than mixing it, I'm using just like a kitchen knife. But it's still, you're kind of folding it. You don't want it to be a chocolate bread. You want it to be a chocolate swirl bread. So I'm using my just regular old knife and I'm kind of folding it in to create sort of this marbleized effect. All right, and it's also helping to mix up the raisins a little bit. And we're just going to do that, and then we are done. Let's do one more little mix, because the alternative is that you have this on the top, and then what happens is the bottom just ends up staying nice and flat with no color to it, which is not a big deal, but that's what it is. Okay, so then what I would do is I would trim. I would leave about an inch, but I would trim the parchment paper on all the sides and then put it in the oven for 55 minutes. It's probably a good amount of time. But then you can check it by doing a toothpick test or taking a sharp knife into the tallest centermost point, putting it in and pulling it out. And if there's no sort of wet batter on it, then you should be good to go. And then what you can do is let it just sit in the tin for a while to cool, and then you can put it on a cooling rack for a while to cool, and then you should be able to enjoy it. And you can either slice it up then and have it in the fridge, or you can slice it up, put it in the freezer, and then take a piece out and toast it when you want to enjoy it. That seems to go well also. Lots of options. We're going to set this aside. This is going to go into the oven shortly. And I did make another loaf, so I wanted to show you guys that so you see what it looks like in the middle. So here is our sliced babka, and you can see the beautiful marbling of that cinnamon chocolate spread. And it's not everywhere, so it doesn't make it be this incredibly sweet bread. Babka is usually sort of temperate. But you can also see the beautiful plump raisins that are throughout. So I took a piece and I toasted it to give myself a little bit of warmth here, because this came out of the oven a little bit ago. But you can have it cold, but it's so fun to have it hot or warm. And let's just take a little bit off here. And a nice crust. Oh my goodness. The babka dance. So let's talk about it. First of all, it's got a wonderful bread texture. It's a little dense, but it's also soft. You've got the subtle sweetness from that chocolate cinnamon spread, and here and there you get a burst of a raisin in there, which is so wonderfully juicy and plump. It is so delicious on its own, but it's not a heavy-duty sweetness. You can certainly sweeten it even more by adding more honey into the batter. But you can leave it this way, and then it's not incredibly high glycemic. And then you can also put stuff on it. You can use this as a base for a sandwich. When I was growing up, I used to have all kinds of sandwiches with raisin bread. You know, even if it was like a deli sandwich, might have corned beef or, you know, roast beef or turkey and lettuce, and then I would use raisin bread to give it a little bit of that savory and sweet balance. You could do that. You could just take some almond butter or sun butter and just lather it on. That's one of our favorite snacks in the evening. My husband loves to do that to wind down. So super easy, super delicious. I really hope you try this at home. And as always, I'd love to hear from you. So any questions you have or ideas, cravings, wish lists of things you'd love to learn how to make in more of a paleo way, you can check me out on www.simplypaleo.com and just send me an email from there. And as always, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and tune in for more Simply Paleo kitchen episodes soon. Thanks so much.